Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And thank you very much to my panelists. We're going to have a fireside chat on how we are going to make sure that Canada achieves a barrier-free society and country by 2040. And I couldn't be joined by better people to tell you about how this is going to happen. Bios can be found. I think if you use the QR code on the program, you can look at bios. We're pretty packed, so we won't get into, we'll just say names at this time. So my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Philip, Michael, and Stephanie. They're going to go into a little bit of detail about how they are making sure Canada is going to achieve our goals. So first, Philip, I'm going to start with you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your role in the context of the Accessible Canada Act.
Absolutely. So Philip Rascala, I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Accessibility Standards Canada, and I have the privilege of being the first person in this role. Our role is very simple. As the name indicates, Accessibility Standards Canada, we develop standards that will help to remove barriers to accessibility, which will move us towards an end goal of a barrier-free Canada by 2040. So we play a small role, but it's one of the pieces of the puzzle that you'll soon hear about.
Thanks, Philip. And so let's go into the second piece of that puzzle then. Over to you, Stephanie. You can tell us a little bit about your role.
Sure. So hi, I'm Stephanie, and I'm an independent advisor to the minister responsible, Minister Kara, who you just heard from. And my job is to really keep a 40,000-foot view of what's going on in the country and beyond the country, to liaise with all of you, people with disabilities in Canada, to get a read on whether or not you're seeing change, where those priority areas are, and to keep an eye on what all of these guys are doing, and make sure that we're moving in the right direction together. It's my first report. As in my role, I have to provide a report to the minister on an annual basis. My first report will come out sometime in January. And at that point, I welcome you to engage with me in my office and on our go forward plans.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Michael, we're thrilled to have you. I don't know if you've noticed, but Michael's not on our agenda. So we're thrilled to be able to have you here with us on stage. And so Michael, maybe you can fill in that puzzle.
Thank you so much. My name is Michael Gottheil, Canada's first accessibility commissioner appointed under the Accessible Canada Act. And my role, well, technically is to enforce the regulations that Philip recommends to the government, and they are enacted. So once those are enacted, my responsibility, along with my team, is to enforce those regulations, and also down the road to receive complaints from members of the public who feel they have suffered economic, physical, or emotional harm where an entity has failed to comply with the regulations. Sometimes I feel like my real role is herding turtles. You know, those things that move really slowly. And if you try to get them moving in direction, like crossing that 2040 finish line, they look at you and it's like, what? But no, it's been a pleasure to work with Philip and Stephanie and many people in this room and others to get government entities and private sector companies to really adopt the principles and ensure that they comply with the regulations. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. That's great. So I think, Stephanie, I'm going to start with you with my first question. So how can we take proactive, innovative measures to not only identify and remove barriers for persons with disabilities, but also prevent the creation of new ones? Easy.
Easy.
At you.
Well, and this is really where my role as a champion and a challenger inside government comes into play, to remind them that it's nothing without us, period. all of the policies and procedures that are put in place, all of the work that goes on needs to start with a conversation with people with disabilities about what the barriers are and what does it actually mean to remove them. I'm just going to give a really quick example. It's one thing people find, I think it easier to think about accessibility in the terms of the physical environment and those really concrete things like ramps. That's not too hard. But what does it mean when we're talking about policy? So, example, governments across the country are pushing forward quickly and spending money on electric vehicle charging stations. Nobody bothered to talk about the fact that they should be accessible. They have to be accessible. Guess what? People with disabilities sometimes drive, and they sometimes drive electric cars. But if we're building infrastructure that's looking into the future, we have to make sure that we're building it for everyone. And so Philip has a role to play in making sure there's a standard. But the challenge is not letting the policy and the investment go ahead of that standard. And that's where all of us come into play.
Thank you. So kind of along those lines then, Michael, I'm going to ask you the next question about monitoring and evaluating the Act and accessibility standards to assure that they do align with other policies and legislation so that we're not getting in our own way.
Yeah, so, you know, the three of us work closely together. Stephanie hosts a table with other agencies, Canadian Transportation Agency, CTA, who are also responsible for enforcing the Act. But what I would say is one of the things that I've committed to is really collecting the data that we get from our enforcement efforts. And of course, our enforcement efforts are not simply, you know, issuing fines. In fact, there's lots that goes on before that and will go on in terms of, you know, providing, interacting with organizations and what they need and what we're hearing back. And when we were, for example, with the accessibility plans, we've received 160 from the federal government departments, which is great. It's 100% compliance. Not so good on the private sector companies, only about 22% compliance, but we're on that. But we want to collect what is in those plans and what we're seeing. And we want to report on that, the levels of compliance, but also the substantive pieces, where the gaps are. And that, of course, is, you know, built into the Act. It's transparency, and transparency is good, accountability. But it also provides an opportunity for the disability community to use that information because, you know, we're not going to get to an accessible Canada only because of me, Philip, and Stephanie. It's going to be, as it always has been, through the collective efforts of the disability community, their families and supporters. So when we collect the data, we want that out there for researchers and community activists to really understand where the gaps are, where the gains are being made. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. By the way, we will have time at the end of this chat for questions from you. So if you've got some questions of Bruin, make sure you make a note so that when we come to the Q&A period, you haven't forgotten. So Philip, are you working on an accessibility standard for employment?
Good question. We are. Actually, we're working on an employment standard.
And when is that going to be released?
So it went out for public review in July, mid-July. The consultation ended in mid-November. So the committees are now going through a number of the comments, well over 800 comments received, which is quite a bit. So we're hoping that by next year, I'm not going to give a month yet because it depends on the complexities of the comments, we'll have a standard that we can make a recommendation to our minister.
And then what happens?
Well, it's an interesting process. So There's a lot of steps. So I don't want to speak on behalf of what happens to it for the regulatory part, because that's outside of my control. So I have one little piece that I'm responsible for, which is developing that standard and making sure that standard is developed properly. So a number of things can happen. We can, in the interim, we can start piloting that standard. We can start working with other departments, private sector, government departments, seeing what works, what doesn't work. We can go into the community and get more feedback on that standard. And when we're comfortable with that standard, then we can make a recommendation that, you know, we've been trying this, it works. We're seeing good results, or in some cases, we've tried it and it conflicts with some other policies that exist. We may need to make some tweaks, and then we can make a recommendation upwards for adoption into regulation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So knowing that a lot of the standards, a lot of employment, and we in the room know this, a lot of employment for people are provincially regulated. So how are you working with provinces and territories around that?
Yeah, so I'm going to step back a little bit. Anybody familiar with the Act understands that the Act speaks about federal entities, the federal government's federal entities, but it also says that we have to have a barrier-free Canada by 2040. So we recognize that just working with our federal partners, the airline industry, the banking industry, government departments is not going to achieve that goal of 2040. So we are working very, very diligently with provincial governments, territorial governments. We've got several agreements signed with these governments. So we share best practices. In some cases, they've agreed to actually look at our standards and maybe even adopt them into legislation. So it's kind of a cooperative approach that we're taking. And we're hoping that by using our standards, piloting them, going back to them, telling them this works, we have some good guidance here, they will start taking these standards up within their jurisdictions.
Excellent, thank you. Over to you, Stephanie. Ready? How will you ensure that you are meeting the goals of removing barriers for people with disabilities in Canada? In other words, how are you going to measure success?
That's a good question. I think the first thing is to not let perfect be the enemy of good, and really encourage all of the folks involved, everybody from the federal government down to those in the private sector and community, encourage them to get started. Start now. Don't wait for it to be perfect, because there is no perfection. What there is what we need is a desire to constantly learn and improve and move forward. So measuring that is going to be difficult. Also, measuring accessibility across an entire society is difficult. The data doesn't exist to go where we are to where we want to be. So a lot of it is going to be anecdotal. But I think I think, and I know I can say that there is movement and it is promising. Just like Philip says, a barrier-free Canada doesn't stop with the federal government, right? And I've been at federal, provincial, territorial meetings as a minister. And traditionally, they are a conversation that is very one-sided. It is ministers telling all the other ministers what their province is doing and isn't that great. And everybody comes out with a statement at the end that we're all working together. But really not a lot of concrete actions or progress. And what I can tell you is the conversations that Philip's leading with provinces on the alignment of the goals and on really truly trying to make this work for people. Those conversations are really fruitful. They're very engaged. I was asked to come and be a part of that last year, and I was really impressed with the willingness and the commitment of everybody to try and do the right thing here. But we're a long way from perfection. We're a long way from getting there. And I'm not sure how we're going to measure that. I'm not sure what success is going to look like. But I'll know it when I see it. I've been in this world for 30 years as an advocate, as an individual who cares about this stuff as deeply as anyone else in this room. And as a politician trying to make change from the inside. And now at this level, trying to make change from the inside as a bureaucrat. It's slow. But there is progress, and I have never seen the engagement on these issues like I have in this first year in this job, both here in Canada and abroad. The world is talking about accessibility and inclusion in a way it never has before. And while all of us are impatient, I am as impatient as anyone. We are seeing progress.
Thank you. Michael, it looked like you had a few things that you wanted to add to what Stephanie was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Stephanie that perfect can't be the enemy of the good. But as people with disabilities, we know that, you know, just good doesn't always do it. So, for example, if a building has 6 stairs to get in and you only remove 5 of them, that's great. We've made progress, but you can't get in the building if you're in a wheelchair. So, you know, we need to be strategic. I agree with Stephanie and Philip. I think, you know, that is true. But this is why the engagement of the disability community and all of the community is so important, because somebody who doesn't live in our world can say, well, look what we've done. This is great. We've spent all this money, but you know, it's only those with lived experience. Well, not only, but especially those with lived experience could say, yeah, that's great. We appreciate it, but you know, I still can't use it, or I can still get in. And so the good has to really encompass all of the things that are needed for individuals to be able to participate and contribute.
Thank you. Thanks. Philip, over to you now. So, as you know, we're here, Disability and Work in Canada. We're talking about employment, we're talking about jobs, we're talking about work, we're talking about workers, and we're also talking about employers and businesses. So my question to you is, how will the Accessible Canada Act and specifically accessibility standards help employers and businesses to be more inclusive and accessible to achieve full and equal participation of persons with disabilities at their workplaces? How are you going to do that?
It's a good question. So before I answer the question, I'm going to tell you what we're doing, because that will actually put it into context. So when I talked about our organization developing standards, most of you probably had a glaze over your eyes, because it really isn't, it's not really a very exciting topic. But the reality is standards have been around for 100 years in this country. And as we can see, they've been failing the community of persons with disabilities. So what we've done is we've taken a really novel approach to how we develop our standards. And this will get to your answer, I promise. We've taken a novel approach. And so what we've done right from the top up, we have board of directors. Maureen is one of our board of directors, and they represent the community of persons with disabilities. We have staff that are a large percentage of persons with disabilities. And then we create committees, technical committees, with over 50% of our members being persons with disabilities. So this is very unique, because in order to make change, you have to change the process that we actually create these standards, so that we don't end up with similar standards that actually avoid or neglect the group that we're trying to help. So we're developing standards with the community in mind, well-represented, gender representation, fully inclusive committees, providing all the support we can. And we hope that will end up giving us a product in the end that will actually meet the needs of the community, will meet the needs of the employers. And I think we're making success. So not only are we doing this, but we have the rest of the world is looking at us and saying, wow, this is interesting. If you live in the standards world, and I've lived, unfortunately, in the standards and codes world for 35 years, most of these committees are 90% males, very few representation from the community, and they're making decisions on your behalf. What we've done is we've changed that, and we've changed the policies to do that. So what I hope is that the results, the standards, the documents that are going to be used for regulations will actually have all that feedback, and they'll be meeting the needs of the community. So it makes it easier when we go back and employers have to use these, because we come back to them and say, this is a standard you need to use when you're hiring, when you're recruiting, when you're retaining, when you're training your staff. And we can validate this because your peers have, the people that actually need this are the ones that provided the input into the development. So I think we're going to have success in that sense.
Because it's been created, the standards have been created by the very users who are going to
Exactly.
who are going to benefit. Perfect, thank you. So I think that this is our last question. Over to you, Stephanie, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So what advice in your current role, but also in your previous roles, what advice would you give to employers and business leaders in shifting from discussing accessibility, like just having that discussion, but actually doing concrete actions around accessibility?
Just start. Just do it, please. It's about taking ownership and leadership. And I talk a lot about allyship when I'm talking about disability. But really, leadership, good leadership is allyship if it's done well. Talk about it. Make training of your staff mandatory, not optional. Take the training yourself. Make sure it works. And then follow up and find out, is it effective? Make sure that that training involves people with disabilities and it isn't just something on a piece of paper. The reality is that in the work that we're leading and in the work that is being undertaken now because of the Act, the biggest challenge and the biggest impediment to that work being successful is culture. And if we don't change the culture, then we can put any checklist in place, we can put any regulation into place, and it is not going to matter. The culture has to change first. Employers, leaders in government have the responsibility to change that culture. So I'm going to share an example to illustrate this, because the world is looking at Canada. And that's great. But we have to look elsewhere too. And last year I was in Vienna. And I was there for the Zero Project Conference. And on the Friday afternoon, they had a field trip to McDonald's to learn about inclusive hiring. And I thought, I don't need to do that. I don't need to go there. We have employers in Canada that are doing a good job of this, including McDonald's. So I'm like, what could I possibly see? But heck, you know what? It's on that shopping street. So you know what? I'm going to go. Boy, I thought I wasn't going to learn anything, but I did. Not only was this the most beautiful, aesthetically pleasing McDonald's I have ever seen in my life, it was huge. It was 500 seats. Like, you've never seen anything like this. But the conversation we had with the owner of that establishment was unbelievable. He started out telling us he had 17 McDonald's in Austria. And he had decided he wanted his organization, his unit, his places to reflect the community they served. So he set out to do some inclusive hiring. The first people through the door were deaf. And he and his managers thought, well, how are we going to deal with this? Well, we need to figure out how we're going to communicate with these employees. They didn't ask the employees to do something. They trained their entire staff in how to communicate in sign language with the new employees. They flipped the script the way we need to flip the script in Canada, largely. They've been very successful. They now have about 15% of their employees in all of their locations come from the disability community, many of them deaf, some of them autistic, some of them people with intellectual disabilities. And they are now at all levels of those organizations, from frontline to managers. And what have they found? Gee, guess what? The clients coming in, the customers coming in have adapted as well. And they bring out their phones to text and interact. And what they found is actually having this sign language. Now, obviously, it's not fulsome with everyone, but they've got these signals now, and they're finding, gee, that works better than yelling across a crowded restaurant. Just like texting was something that was developed for people with disabilities that we all now use. It just works. Accessibility works for everybody. So we have to flip that script. And that's a long-winded example of how we can, and employers can put this into practice. But it's not rocket science.
No.
Just get started.
Just get started. Flip that script. Thank you very much. All a great start to our morning. And I think now we've got a little bit of time. Stephanie has to leave us
5 minutes.
first. So maybe we're going to, if anybody's got a question that Stephanie can focus on, I see a few hands, and then we can open it up. So do I have a runner? Steve, are you? Perfect. Thanks. I'll give you this microphone. You can do it.
Hi, and thank you. Thank you for what you had to say. It was really interesting to me. One of the areas I think we have to remember is when we talk about living experiences. I tend to say that because I'm not dead yet. My living experiences has also, we have to consider not just disability, but identity, and look at intersectional, which is the term now, around many identities. And as my friend Ben from Toronto says, I love all my identities. And I think we all need to embrace that we all come from cultures, from age groups, from sexual orientation, from many identities that make us up. And sometimes some of us don't look at our disability as the front runner. We'll maybe look at our race and we will identify from that perspective, or in my case, from my age. I mean, I'm still surprised how I'm being hit on after all these years, but you know, it comes with the territory. And I'm just wondering, from the three of you, how do you incorporate that in your thinking? And when you are discussing disability, and say, as the conference is about employment, to also have employers and their staff prepared to deal with issues. One of the things that someone had once said to me is the only time they're blind and in their job, the only time people talk to them about is when an issue of race comes up. Or they want to know, well, what does the blind community think? But they never invite them out to coffee. They don't go pub crawling at night. They're not included in the regular. And I would like to see us more regular. It just be a normal. But I'm interested in that component as well, because at CCD, it's a very important discussion all of us across across Canada, and certainly within the disability community and movement, are having to understand and deal with identity. Thank you.
Well, Heather, I identify as disabled, but it's not the first thing I think about, right? And intersectionality, of course, matters. One of the things we're, I think, challenged with in this work is that quite often accessibility is lumped in with diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, but forgotten. And the challenge is all of these things matter, and they all take effort and they all take work. my job is to make sure that the disability piece doesn't get forgotten. The accessibility piece doesn't get forgotten in all of that intersecting work. But if we do the work correctly to make Canada barrier-free, then all of that other work around race, identity, will be easier. And the reason I say that is because when we make something accessible, then nobody's left out of the conversation. But if we aren't making things accessible, then disability is always left out of the conversation. So it's complex work. But part of the work that we will do in making sure that accessibility and disability are not left out of the equation is make sure that when we're doing our work, we are also trying to model that inclusion across and the intersectionality across race, age, and all of the other things that people bring when they bring their whole self.
Yeah, can I, thank you. I think part of the reason is that it's only until I think very recently that disability has been an identity that people with disability have been able to define, right? So for so many years, it was the medical profession that would define us, or the laws that would define us, or put us away in hospitals and institutions. It's interesting, during the civil rights movement in the United States in the 60s, there's a real tension that many of the leaders and of the movement didn't want people with disabilities involved. And because it was seen as, well, you're not the same, like you're not unequal because of your characteristics, like race or color. You're unequal because you're defective. You are really not the same. And that's what disables you. Now, of course, we know in recent years, and a good thing too, that people with disabilities have started to say, no, that's, we actually do have an identity, and we can feel it as a positive thing, as something we can be, we can occupy in our own bodies and our perspectives. And I think with that change, now it's not that things aren't hard for us, absolutely. And we do, for some of us, experience pain or, sorrow or whatever. But I think more and more people with disabilities are really claiming an identity as being different, and that's not defective. And once that, I think, is embedded, then I think the intersectionality, can be expressed and recognized and responded to by employers and others.
Maureen, I have to jut out, and I know there were a couple more questions. I just want to say, reach out to me, to my office, with your questions and your input. It's important to us and important to me. So please reach out. Okay. See you guys later.
Hello. I wanted to thank Philip and Stephanie. It's nice to see you. This is Lisa Arneson from Ashe Community Foundation for Black Canadians with Disabilities. So Heather, thank you for starting off that very important conversation about, you call it intersectionality. And for everybody will know, if you come to my session tomorrow, intersectionality is not a new concept. It's a concept that racialized people and Black people and Indigenous people have been going through, well, for Black people for centuries. And so my question to accessibility standards is, the standards themselves, so we keep having this conversation about including people. I'm talking about race, not, I'm talking about categories of oppression that have left people behind and continued those disparities. So in the standards, regulations, is there anything within them or is opportunity to talk about that relationship when they're working with accessibility? Because the lessons we have learned as Black people is the accessibility comes first, and our race, our experiences, our traumas, our intergenerational traumas, they all lay to the side. How is it within the standards that is built in and not like a catch-all at the end? If we get accessibility, the Black people will get support. We don't. We're left out, and people don't understand the experiences. And unfortunately, we experience anti-Black racism. So how does it work within the standards? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So is my mic on? Yeah. Can I just use the mic? Yeah, sure. Oh, I'll just use Michael's mic. So thank you very much for the question. And intersectionality actually plays a very important role for us when we're developing our standards. So I'm going to talk about it from two fronts. First of all, from the committees themselves, intersectionality is paramount when we select the members on our committee. Our board of directors holds us accountable. We make sure we have representation from all races, colors, genders, disabilities. They're all represented within our committees. And we actually sometimes delay our committees by months to make sure we have the right representation on those committees. So just by having the right makeup, which is unique when it comes to standards development, as I mentioned earlier, most of them were one category of membership, and now we've deliberately gone and made it quite intersectional. Also, when the committees are actually working and doing the work, it's embedded in their philosophy when they're coming up with solutions, when they're coming up with technical solutions within their standards. So it is embedded in the content itself. Now I'm going to give an example. This is the second part. We go out, we talk to various communities, and we were trying to find out we went to the territories and say, what is the biggest challenge that you have in the territories? And they have a large Indigenous community in the territories. So we recognize that if we sit in our office and we develop a guide or a standard for them, it's not going to work because we're not taking into the needs of those communities. So we asked them, what would work for you? And they said, well, if you want to create something for us, don't call it a standard, call it a guide. First thing. If you want to create something for us, let us create it. Help us to create it, but let our community, our membership, the people that live within our community create it. And that's exactly what we've done. We've gone to them and they put together their band councils, they put together their communities, and we're just helping facilitate and kind of work and providing the research and the funding and the resources so they can create what they need for their community. So we do look at it from multifaceted approach.
Morning. Thank you, everybody. It's Carrie Jaffe speaking from Arch Disability Law Center. My question is about how we relate to the standards. So when the Accessible Canada Act was being developed, and many of us in this room were, part of the advocacy to improve and strengthen the act, one of the things that we were really concerned about was that the standards would be related to as the maximum, the only thing that regulated entities had to do to actually become accessible. And we talked a lot in Parliament and lobbying with, the elected officials that were responsible for bringing the act into force about how standards are really a minimum, a floor, and not a ceiling, right? Like standards should be able to guide everybody and tell us what we need to do, but shouldn't be the only thing that needs to be done to make, federally regulated entities fully accessible. So I just want to know if that's something that is in your minds when you're working, Philip, on standard development at Accessibility Standards Canada, and Michael, when you're looking at enforcement of the act and reviewing the accessibility plans, is that idea around a floor and not a ceiling part of what you're thinking about? Thank you.
So can I take this first? So, yeah. So thank you very much for the question. So You're right. Standards codes are generally based on minimum acceptable. That's the principle across the world. That's how people develop standards. You can always build better than that. You can buy a Pinto or you can buy a Cadillac. It's your choice. But at the very least, the car better be able to drive and stop. So that's your minimum. What we do at Accessibility Standards Canada is pretty unique. We still work under principle of minimum acceptable, but what we say, it has to be inclusive. So code standards today are generally developed for the 75th percentile of the population. All we've done is said, keep developing your standards at a minimum, but make it 100% of the population. So obviously we're not going to get to 100% the first shot, but let's at least bump it from 75% to at least 95% of the population. So if we start developing our standards, again, based on minimum, the minimum is get somebody into a building. Okay, that's the minimum. So it's not just get people that are able to walk into the building, get everybody into the building. So that's the minimum, that stays the minimum. So we are moving the bar so that we're actually designing our standards so that it captures the outliers. And the outliers is that outside 25% of the population, persons with disabilities, persons that are marginalized, et cetera, et cetera. So still minimum, but the term that we use now is an inclusive standard. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, just a comment, 2 points. One is, from my perspective, in terms of my role, first we need the standard. First we need the regulation. And then, we can figure out if it's the floor or the ceiling, but I completely agree with you. I mean, one of my concerns, to date, it's 5 years past, since the act has been enforced. We have one regulation. It has to do with accessibility plans, and that's great. It's important, but I don't call that a substantive standard. The information communication technology, which I think is the next one, or built environment, or some of the standards that Philip's group is working on in terms of emergency exits and that sort of thing. I think that's when my role will start to hopefully bear fruit. But the other thing I would say, and why I totally agree with you, Carrie, is because if we think of it as, that's where we want to get to, then people with disabilities will continue to be excluded, even though, we have an inclusive standard, because it's great to have people with disabilities being able to get into work, but what work are they doing? What work do we have choices to make? Like, what choices do we have? In order to make choices, we have to have choices. And if it's, seen as great, we've achieved, then we may be relegated to, areas of employment that don't actually fulfill our potential or aspirations.
Thanks. So we have time for one more question, Steve, and then and then we're gonna thank our panelists.
My name is Chloe Atkins, and I run something called the Proud Project, and we do research and advocacy, anti-ableism, but we've just finished a 5-country study about employment and disability. And what I wanted to get to is some of the details, because one of the things we've learned is that there can be lots of standards, there can be lots of laws, but if there isn't an enforcement in this study, we discovered really it's toothless. So where there are environments, you talked about fines. What I'm interested in is there, as you're developing this, these standards, a sense of who will be doing the inspection? How often? Where do these fines go once they're actually administered? And those details really do seem to matter. There was a difference between the countries that actually had enforcement measures and had actual detailed plans running through it. Also, that accessibility is a constantly evolving process. And I was wondering, you have research grants that are closed now. I was just wondering what the ongoing sort of evolution of those standards, what's being allowed for that as it moves forward.
Yeah, thanks. The way our approach is, when there are regulations, we develop tools to promote compliance and then enforce compliance. And so the act itself provides sort of a graduated approach with an emphasis on promotion and encouragement and that sort of thing. And I know that I've spoken to many folks in the disability community who, that we have been waiting for so long. There's sort of a feeling like we need to, bring the law down on these things. And so I think that is an inherent frustration that might arise because of the way the act is framed. But the other thing is, again, I think it comes back to we need standards that actually are substantive, that says you must do this by this time. Some of the standards are going to be, quantitative, the counter must be this height or that height. Others may be more qualitative, but certainly we have to, in enforcement, take the lead from the regulation. And this is why I encourage, the community to keep pressing for specific regulations. And in terms of the enforcement itself, I mean, we, for example, I mentioned earlier that only about 22% of large private sector entities have complied with the first regulation by June 1st, which is to submit an accessibility plan. That's very disappointing. I mean, very disappointing. That means like there's over 600 large private sector companies that didn't comply with the law. And so we have actually started to take action. We've sent out warning letters to all of those entities. We've given them deadlines to get back to us. And we're going to follow up and say, okay, what's your commitment date? And, if they don't engage with us and give those commitments, we will start with actual enforcement action requiring compliance and ultimately potentially fines.
Excellent. Thank you very much.